Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Eshalomi. Can I ask my committee members to introduce themselves, please? Chris.
I'm Chris Getz. I'm the Labour MP for Milton Keynes North.
Hi, I'm Michelle Khan. I'm the Labour MP for Gillingham and Rainham.
Hello, Mayor Ellis, the MP for Ribble Valley.
Joe Powell, Kensington and Bayswater.
Will Forster, Woking.
I'm Betts, Sheffield South East, and I'm guesting as Deputy Chair of the Public Accounts Committee.
Lewis Coughlin, Broxbourne.
Gary Ranger, Conservative for South West Hertfordshire.
Can I ask our guests just to introduce themselves for the record, please?
Yeah, Andy Pike. I'm Henry Daysh, Professor of Regional Development Studies in the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Aileen Murphie, Honorary Professor at Durham University Business School and ex-National Office.
I'm Tony Travers, a Professor in the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics.
I'm Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Executive of the Local Government Information Unit.
Good morning. Welcome to the committee today. I think it's fair to say local government finance is always in the news, and this is our first evidence session on the sustainability and funding of local government finance. It's a timely session as well because tomorrow is the close of the consultation that government announced on reforming local government finance. It'll be interesting to see what comes forward on that. I just wanted to start with a question to our guests in terms of everything that's been going on and how the cost pressures and increases that we've seen over the years, the number of councils issuing Section 114 notices. What do you feel has driven the increase in financial distress that we are seeing across local authorities of all political stripes? I'll start with Jonathan.
Thank you. Well, I think over the last 15 years or so, we've seen a perfect storm come together. Obviously, local government funding has been reduced, and it varies across different councils, but funding from central government going down by 40-ish%. At the same time, I think the bit of that story that's less focused on is the councils have therefore become much more reliant on local income, whether that's council tax, whether that's retained business rates. And so effectively there's been a transfer of financial and political risk to councils. While we've seen their income reduce and councils' core spending power has gone down by 20-odd%, we've also seen a massive increase both in demand and cost in the key statutory services that they're required by law to provide. So notably adult social care. Local authorities tell us that is the biggest long-term pressure on their finance. Children's services, which they tell us is the biggest short-term impact on their finances. Temporary accommodation. In all of these areas we've seen demand, so the number of kids with EHCP plans, the number of people requiring special educational needs support, the number of adults requiring domiciliary care, demand has gone up, but cost has also gone up. So if you look at, for example, the cost of children's residential care, which has almost doubled over the last 9 years or so. So really acute pressures. And that circle, I think, we've got to a point where it just can't be squared any longer.
Well, I mean, I couldn't add very much to that excellent summary of what Jonathan said. I mean, I think the difficulty is not just the extent of the reduction in spending over time, and in fairness to successive governments, the last 2 or 3 years has seen a slight uptick in local government's core spending power, but the overall picture back to 2010 is a reduction in spending of 10 to 15% in real terms, 20+% in terms of per capita spending. So that's it's the per capita issue that really drives this. And I think the challenge is that there's no apparent way out. So local authorities get annual funding settlements, or have in recent years, trying to plan in a sort of strategic way to manage spending down and more productively in these circumstances is very difficult, which of course has led councils in a number of years to build up reserves, paradoxically, because the more uncertain life is, the more they think it might get worse in the future, and then build up reserves. It hasn't happened every year, but it happens in a number of years when uncertainty is greatest. So I think that as Jonathan said, and I think we're all going to agree on this one, that this is just a long built-up position, 15 years now, and where, rationally, if you look at the Office for Budget Responsibility and other forecasters and their picture looking forward, given we know the spending aggregates out to 2029, 30, by the time you take out all the protected services, the NHS, state pension and so on, the pressure on unprotected services, which includes local government, continues to the end of this decade.
Aileen.
Thanks. And I won't repeat what my colleagues have said. I think the other thing to note is, though, within the way that, say, grant funding is provided to local authorities, there have been changes that, again, ramp up the pressure on individual authorities. For instance, there are far more grants now that come with quite onerous conditions. Monitoring, you get fewer grants that are without some form of ring fence. And the last government in particular really liked competitive bidding. And again, that adds to that uncertainty for local authorities. They don't know what they're going to get, and they don't know when they're going to get it, and or how much they get. So it makes planning very difficult. So that, combined with multiple short-term initiatives to stave off pressure on one service, like the introduction of adult social care grant, and then a little bit more for children's services, what that does is it undermines good decision making and value for money in local government, because you need to be able to plan long term, and you need to be able to think about capital funding long term as well, to make sure that services are as efficient as they could be. So that's what I'd add to what colleagues have already said.
Yes, difficult to say much more. There's all very good points that are made. I think a couple of things to say. I think the first thing is trying to understand there are obviously structural problems with the funding system, as has been pointed out. The big one in the jargon, unfunded mandates. So basically we're asking local authorities to do things and not providing appropriate matching funding for them. The sources of local income generation are very constrained and very controlled centrally, so the scope for local authorities to actually generate and fill the gaps when grant funding has been reduced becomes a real challenge. And local authorities have, in terms of their agency, their ability to respond to this, deliver savings, to generate other income sources, has been hampered then by austerity reducing their capacity to be able to think and do these things intelligently. So those structure and agency things, I think, are there. It does beg the question, though, fundamental question, which should be addressed as part of this, is what do we want local government to do and how are we going to fund it? Because those basic issues, I think, are really, really central and integral to this, as Tony was saying, long-standing debate. You know, is it just an agency of central government that we want to deliver services for as low a cost as possible, or is it a genuinely democratic tier of the government and the British state, the UK state, that has a democratic position and tries to make decisions to match the needs, the ambitions of local people across the country?
No, and I think that's important. You'll noticed, obviously, the funding settlement last week. The LGA have said that even with the increase, a number of councils will still struggle. Do you think, some of the changes that you've all highlighted, and the government again have been very clear that they want to look at less bidding, remove some of the ring fencing and multi-year settlements? Do you think that scenario that would help, and what more do you think the government could do to help address these financial pressures going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously that it's very welcome. It's been a very busy period, I think, in the local government sector. It's a welcome focus on the problems within the sector more broadly. I think the whole sort of accumulated history, if you like, of adaptations and tweaks. We have a hellishly complex local government funding system, almost Byzantine, I think, in its degree of complexity. So any change is difficult, costly, uncertain, a bit politically difficult as well in some regards. So some of the changes that have been brought in are very welcome. Bring back needs assessment, consultation on the other technical issues, all the things you've mentioned there. I think the key thing is whether it moves it far and fast enough in the direction of real fundamental overhaul, if you like, to try and fix these deep structural problems that we've all highlighted this morning. And some inspiration can be taken, I think, from how other countries operate. They've done some excellent work at the LGIU on this, and also look into things like the European Charter for Self-Government that has a whole set of principles that guide the way in which local government funding is organised in other countries elsewhere, around autonomy, greater tax-raising powers and lots of income-raising things, which I'm sure we'll come on to in later questions.
Lewis.
Can I just ask a follow-up question about bidding? So obviously we've had lots of bidding pots that the last government did. Like, for example, my local authority of Broxbourne got levelling up money. And then the government took a different approach with the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, where each council got about £1 million or thereabouts. And my concern is, if we move away, and I'm not saying which is best, that's why I want your opinion on it. Obviously, if government funds the whole project, you can really transform a town centre, you can do lots of things, you can transform lives. If they gave every local authority £1 million, I can't transform lives with £1 million. Like, I'm worried that if we move to a different model where everyone gets at the same level, some of that will just be wasted. So be interested in your views, bidding wars versus everyone gets a little bit of money to do a tinkering, but it's not really enough to do the whole project. Does that make sense?
Nobody's questioned that.
Penny.
Oh, you go.
Well, I mean, there have always been ring-fenced and specific grants. They're not for and of themselves. You know, the police grant famously has long been a ring-fenced grant. But I think, and Aileen made this point earlier, what's been characteristic of recent years is what's happened effectively is because of the constraints on general funding overall, that ministers in different departments understandably think we need to do something about potholes. So let's have a potholes grant, and then we need to do something about something else, then let's have a something else grant. Now, the levelling up type funds were doing something different again. So I think there is a perfectly respectable question to ask, in addition to the general funding that underpins council tax and local government's day-to-day spending, is there room for specific grants as well? The answer is yes, but I think they have to be very precise of purpose, predictable, and in a sense short term. So the government steps in, regenerates a town centre, for example, then steps back out again. So I think that in a sense the problem we've seen is the proliferation of bidding rounds, which this committee's predecessor looked at this in detail, which I think not only made it hard for local authorities to do all that bidding, but as we know from Public Accounts Committee reports, not all the money was paid out.
And would you say some of that bidding then overlooks some of the hidden deprivation in some areas as well? In terms of, obviously, there'll be winners and losers in some of the bidding pots.
Yeah, the problem with competitive bidding is, or any mode of giving out money from the centre, is it's horses for courses. So what's the problem that you're trying to solve? So is it about a specific development you want to see in a few areas, in which case a competition is a really good way of doing it, and there's a big lump of money? I think the issue is that when you're trying to replace baseline funding, or what should be baseline funding, or needs-related funding with competitive bidding, I think that's where you get to the point where areas that should receive funding, if you looked at the needs assessment, because it hasn't been updated since 13-14, but if you looked at the needs end of the equation, that's the only way they can get money, so they go for it.
You also end up with central government then very much defining the terms of what's needed. So, ahead of the election, I interviewed 63 chief execs and leaders and asked them all about this. And one of the things they said is that even people who'd done quite well out of that bid funding, got money from the Levelling Up Fund, said, look, it's not really how I want to be funded. Yeah. Is it funding the thing that I would most want to do if I could? No, not necessarily. It's we're doing the things that match the funding stream rather than the funding matching the things we need to do. So there's the predictability that it gives you no ability to sort of plan, because you don't know if you're going to get it again next year. So the predictability, as Tony said, is a huge problem. But also, as Aileen said, it distorts the sort of strategic priorities.
Coming on to strategic priorities.
Yeah, just building on that. At the moment, is the way local government funding is allocated, is it reflective of needs of deprivation in your opinion, and does it provide support according to need?
Partly because the needs assessment hasn't been updated since 2013-14, so that's a long time ago now. So therefore, things like rises in deprivation or changes in population or changes in the demographics, the number of working age adults that there are in particular areas that require adult social care funding, which is almost outweighing now the effect that the ageing of the population is having. All those things are not reflected in the needs formula. So the answer, I think, simple answer is no.
And to give an illustration of that, I spoke recently to a council chief exec who said, look, we're spending here £1.5 million a year supporting one individual with very complex needs because they require round-the-clock care from a team of 3 people. So it's £1.5 million. Now, as it happens, our funding is almost entirely drawn through council tax. So is our neighbouring authority. This person, as it happens, lives about 2 streets away from the boundary. If they lived 3 streets west, that bill would fall on a different load. And there's nothing in the way we're funded that recognises that we have that cost and our neighbours don't. Now, to go back to the Chair's question, the government has committed to bringing in multi-year financial settlements, something that 97% of councils that we surveyed said they wanted to see. It's committed to re-examining the needs formula. The question becomes, that's all coming in next year. What happens in the meantime of that steady sort of drumbeat of councils getting closer and closer to bankruptcy? And what happens after that in terms of more significant long-term reform?
I mean, to add to these points, I think the difficulty also is not only is a grant system that depends on measurements of spending need, which needs to be brought up to date, and taxable capacity will change from year to year. But after 12 or 13 years, if you bring in new measurements of need assessment into the grant, there will be substantial shifts in resources from place to place. And in a very tightly constrained system, where there isn't going to be much money, let's not be naive, there isn't going to be a lot of money, then you are going to be taking money away from some councils to give it to others. That's the only way that can happen, unless there's a sudden flooding of the system with a lot more money. And I think it would be naive to expect a lot more money. So you end up, with transitional arrangements that go on forever.
And just to build on that, in terms of if changes that are made around kind of allocating more towards deprivation, what will be the challenges to more affluent areas?
Well, they'll get less money. So other things being equal. I mean, sorry, Aileen.
No, I was going to say was I cut off the end of your sentence there. If they get less money, then they'll have to find money from elsewhere, so their council tax will go up, or they'll rely more on fees and charges or locally generated income of one sort or another.
From the conversations you've had, and you mentioned sort of speaking to a lot of execs, is there sort of planning for that? Is there kind of what are the steps that those kind of more affluent areas are looking at taking to deliver that?
I think there is some planning around. Well, we've already seen a whole bunch of councils requesting the capacity to put council tax up by more than the amount they're allowed to now. The planning is relatively limited, though, because councils have already been pulling all the strings they have. So, yes, they can put up fees and charges on everything from cremations to swimming pools. They're already doing that year on year. They're already raising council tax. I mean, the vast majority of councils, 9 out of 10 raising council tax, the vast majority of them by the absolute maximum they can. One of the challenges here is that when and Andy talked about some of the ways people do it in other countries, places that do this, frankly, better than us, have a much wider range of revenue options for councils, whether that's sort of personal taxes, whether that's different forms of charges, whether that's different forms of investment. The capacity for which they can prepare for that is really limited.
Sharba, you want us to come in quickly?
Yes, so just a slightly different question, but I just wanted to see if the panel had any views on whether local government reorganisation could help address some of this, and whether some of those areas where you have potential pockets of poverty and might go sort of a bit hidden when you're looking at some of this could be addressed through a reshaping of local government, or if you think that would create further challenges.
I mean, I can kick off if you want. This is a big controversial topic. I mean, it seems that the kind of big picture agenda seems to be it's like a Venn diagram. You've got local government reorganisation, unitarisation, then devolution, and then funding things, and it's trying to get all those 3 things together, I think, to try and help resolve some of these big issues. The question is whether that's a huge agenda. Can you do it in such a short period of time? But it's certainly something, arguably, that needs doing, particularly to address some of the funding questions. So I think the hope, and again it's based on at best mixed evidence really, that fewer bigger authorities would actually get economies of scale and actually reduce the cost of service provision to try and address some of the financial challenges within the sector. So it is difficult, and I guess with the overarching kind of national focus upon growth, it's whether that local government reorganisation then will actually be trying to get local authorities in a better position to be able to contribute to that national growth mission. That seems to be the overarching way in which this has been kind of articulated.
I mean, I think the question of where most deprived areas end up after reorganisation is important, because in some places we're going to see, as it were, counties broken up. So you're going to have social care, social welfare type services, which are currently in county of 1 million or 1.5 million, broken down into 2, 3 or 4 smaller authorities. Now that risks, I'm not saying it will happen, it risks deprived areas being more concentrated, not less. It could go either way, and it much depends on the pattern of local government that emerges from the structural change that's going on outside big cities across England.
I think that's right. I mean, there are certainly counties in which the likely form of unitarisation will create some that are much wealthier than others and could exacerbate that problem. I think there are lots of reasons to reorganise local government. I'm not sure that saving money is one of them. I think the evidence on that is relatively weak. And I think what's really important is Andy's point. The government was really clear in the financial policy statement at the end of November that devolution, public service reform, finance reform all have to be seen as part of a single initiative, and that's right. I think the challenge is it's not clear in practice that they are being done together. They're happening in different parts of government. They're happening at different speeds, right? So social care reform, Louise Casey is going to tell us about in 2028. The finance reform is starting next year. Devolution's happening right now. Yeah. So how we tie these things together to ensure that they do kind of work as part of a single coherent strategic plan remains work in progress.
I think some key thoughts that we will put to the Minister when he's before us. Nishaba.
Thank you. So actually probably leads into a little bit of what I was going to ask next, which is just around the cost pressures. I think you've alluded to a couple already, but what do you think are the most significant cost pressures, in your opinion, that currently local authorities are facing?
Cost pressures, adult social care, the ageing of the population and the rise in the growth of working age adults who will need care for the rest of their lives. Children's social care, every part of children's social care is rising, referrals, etc., if you look at all the different parts of the system. And then with the market failure there is in things like residential care placements, which was commented on in the McAllister review, that's and the sorts of individuals that Jonathan just cited there about, individual very expensive cases to support, particularly in children's social care, I think is an issue. And then the rise in households in temporary accommodation. And the problem with that is there's nowhere to discharge people from temporary accommodation. So we call it temporary, but if you look at the numbers, you see people or families in temporary accommodation for 5-6 years. And in fact, the cost of homelessness has made at least one local authority, Eastbourne District Council, that in itself has made them apply for exceptional financial support, the pressures of it. So those 3 things. And then there's all the background things like inflation, national living wage, employers' national insurance as well.
Just picking up on adult social care and SEND services, what do you think has kind of led to the quite drastic increase in recent years in terms of those provisions? Or do you think that's been something that has been sort of ramping up for a number of years now? We're just reaching a bit of a pinch point.
Well, when I was at the National Audit Office, we did produce a number of reports on adult social care that showed very clearly that the demographics are all against us, and the rise in cases was upward, and the cost would follow. So the way, how would you stop the rise in the cost of adult social care? Well, in which case I think you then need to think about preventative support much earlier on, because one of the things we've got is people are waiting a long time for assessment and waiting a long time for services. So once they come into the system, they're that much more dependent. And so therefore the amount of support they need is much greater. And then you get that interplay between huge amount of domiciliary care, or do you have somebody in residential care, which they're never going to come out of effectively. So there's a number of different things happening here, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Just to Aileen's excellent list, there's also special educational need costs, which the Public Accounts Committee has reported could amount to deficits of 4.6 billion by March 2026. And at the moment, councils are effectively holding these so-called negative reserves on their books. But something will have to be done about that as well, because it's an additional cost pressure in the authorities. And it varies from place to place. Some have lots of pressures, some much, much less. But overall, it's a significant additional challenge.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point that these are all important issues. I think we kind of live in a very kind of volatile, uncertain age. A lot of academic commentators describe it as a polycrisis. It's a very volatile, uncertain, kind of polarising times, if you like. So I think a lot of those wider economic, social, environmental challenges are kind of buffeting countries across the world. And I think our kind of funding system and the way our local government finances are set up kind of amplifies and intensifies a lot of those difficulties. Demographic ageing is not something unique to the UK, but it's the way in which our system kind of ratchets that up in terms of its effect. The inflation and so forth that's come on the back of Brexit, the pandemic, the Ukraine war. All these issues have kind of buffeted countries in different ways and worked its way through the structures. I think, as was mentioned by colleagues earlier as well, that often these cost pressures get very geographically concentrated in particular places, literally by virtue of the economic and demographic structures of certain places, and even the way in which sometimes they have almost national functions, if you like, that kind of concentrate the demand for particular services. So Croydon was one of the local authorities that have issued several Section 114, these unbalanced budget notices. And we've been doing a bit of work on this. One of the issues they have is they are the main point of entry, as they would describe it, for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children and young people. So that's almost like a national function in their borough that is being hit by a massive increase in demand and the cost of provision. So geographical localisation of these things really begs that the system has a much more geographically sensitive way of dealing with these issues.
So just off the back of that, because I think a couple of things have been mentioned and suggestions that there is just things that we're perhaps not approaching in the right way as a country. What do you think are some of the solutions to these funding models and how they're operating at the minute in local government, and perhaps how we could potentially alleviate that pressure if we were to do things slightly differently? What could that look like?
Well, I think it's easier to talk about adult social care. So as Aileen said, we need to be intervening much earlier. We need to be, adult social care starts in midlife, right? So we need to be helping people to live healthily, independently, to make provision for their financial provision for their care in the future. All of that we need to be taking far earlier. By the time people enter the care system, as Aileen said, it's often too late, and they have very complex, they have greater needs, and they're making decisions under stress, and it's all very difficult. So we need that. We need more preventative spend. We need to move towards more effective community health care. We talk a lot about the integration of health and social care, and people talk about National Care Service. I think we need to be careful because, yes, we need integration between social care and the health system so that we're getting people out of hospital. Too much of this, by the way, is taken up by a conversation about delayed discharge. We should be thinking about how we stop people going into hospital in the first place, not how we get them out of it. And that means that that social care needs to integrate with health, yes, but also with planning, with housing, with street design, with leisure services, with a whole bunch of stuff that local government is responsible for. So we need to be thinking in a much more holistic way. And I think we know how to do that with adults. Children's services, Aileen talks about, we understand fairly well why demand is growing in adult social care. It's much more complicated, I think, for children. There are some proximate causes that we know. EHCP is covering a larger age range. Market failures, 23% profit on average being taken out of children's residential care. But I think there's also a much bigger picture of how we are as a society failing younger people, and why have we got a mental health crisis amongst children? Why have we got so many more kids needing support? I don't think we do know the answers to that, and that is an urgent problem.
Very quickly.
On the prevention question, I think we all agree on that. It's interesting, if you look at the funding of public health since it was transferred back to local government as compared with the NHS, there's been significantly more money spent on the NHS than public health. So the prevention part, less well funded than the curing part. So I think there is definitely somewhere to look on that, in that particular sphere of public endeavour, of what the government's priorities, or local and national government's priorities are. But I think the straight answer to your question is, if we assume there isn't going to be lots more money, then one thing that would help is predictability over time. So the 3-year settlements, obviously, but frankly, not only the 3-year settlements, but a general sense that there's stability in public policy would make the money that they have, local government has, be used more productively. Now, the question of the reorganisation on top of that, separate issue for another hearing.
Thank you.
There's a teeny tiny question just to build on that, was just in terms of those local ecosystems and that kind of redistribution potentially of responsibilities, is there anything else you think is missing there? And I'm wondering in terms of like the type of talent we attract to local government, for example, or that, or those kind of services, what's missing where we don't have lots of money? What's the thing that's stopping those collaborations? I feel like certainly my constituency, that's often the question people ask, is there's not that interaction, that collaboration. Why does that work well in some places and not in others, in order to make the best use of the money that we have?
I think it's sort of a matter of history and geography, and sometimes, although it's probably not general, ancient enmities between different places, as you might say. I think, or the fact it's just simply never been done before. And then I think another thing that you used to see very often when I was with the National Audit Office, we'd go out and look at a service that was doing innovative and new things. It depended entirely on 1 or 2 people being in particular jobs. Yeah. So if you want to roll something out nationally, and if you want everyone to do something, then it has to be systemic. And it has to be implemented properly, as opposed to, well, they're doing it really brilliantly there. Oh no, X is left. What are we going to do now, type thing.
Just going to move on swiftly. Looking at key thing that I hear loud and clear from councils, raising revenue. Gagan.
Thank you, Chairman. So we've heard one side of the equation about the cost pressures. The other side of that will be raising revenue. Many of us around this table are former councillors, or I think some are even current councillors. And you alluded to this in the previous answers, where local leadership and local circumstances will dictate opportunities. How do we encourage that entrepreneurial flair without effectively turning that council's finances into a casino?
Indeed.
I mean, yeah, this was a theme of a book I did a couple of years back, Financialisation of Local Statecraft. I mean, that was really trying to question whether, in fact, we had turned local government finance into councillors at the casino. And, well, because we had a lot of very high-profile stories, didn't we, of reckless risk-taking by ignorant councillors, didn't know the kind of problems and risks that they were taking on.
Former councillors.
No, indeed, yes. We'll come to Woking, perhaps, at some point later. But what we did with that piece of work was have a look across the piece, and it's a very differentiated landscape. Only about 30-odd local authorities were really doing the vanguard stuff that was really risky, and the wheels came off there. There was probably 40% or so that National Audit Office revealed with their commercial property study, less active, and a very, very long tail. More than half of the 317 local authorities weren't doing anything of this at all. So I guess in answer to your question, one of the key things is trying to, I guess, encourage entrepreneurialism, innovative approaches to these things, but with, crucially, the governance intact to ensure that these things have proper accountability, oversight, scrutiny and so forth. Because I think when you do, as we've done for our sins, wade through all the Section 114 reports that have been published, much of it is about governance failure. Mm-hmm. You know, the lack of leadership, of management, of the kind of non or weak compliance with existing standards and structures, the informalisation, non-minuted briefings, all this kind of stuff. Nobody knew what was going on, lack of transparency, even illegality in some cases. So it's having better use of the existing governance systems, I think, to guard against that. And then the exhortation then for more innovation, more entrepreneurial activity, I think might sit on a more solid institutional foundation then that would avoid some of the risks that we've seen manifest then in the, what are we on? With Barnet the other day, 9 Section 114s now since 2018.
Yeah. Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a big project with the University of Northumbria looking at this in other countries. We call it embedded autonomy. So councils have autonomy and flexibility and greater flex around revenue sources, but it's within a clear system of governance arrangements that provide accountability, etc. I do think that there is, we also need to be clear-sighted about this. There's, from the centre, we're always saying, we want them to be entrepreneurial, but we don't want any risk. Well, we're going to have to make our minds up. Yeah, there is a degree of risk in that, and it's about deciding as a country and being clear about that and how far we want to allow that.
Annie?
I mean, clearly, giving councils reasonable freedom to set fees and charges is, respectable way of allowing them some discretion as to raising money other than from the council tax. Difficulty with that is, of course, some councils have a much greater capacity to raise money from fees and charges than others, but that's beyond that. We have seen the arrival on the scene in recent years of new ways of adding to local revenue, but for example, business improvement districts, where they've existed because they release at the margin, often in cities, but not only in cities, substantial amounts of money for town centre management and things such as that, but they're not directly part of local government. But I think a debate of this kind also raises the question, controversial though it might be, and which is being discussed here and there in local government, as to whether new taxes, such as tourism taxes, might be added to the range, not compulsorily, but where councils want to, and it couldn't be more than that, new forms of revenue that take the pressure off council tax, given that council tax, separate issue, badly needs reform. So trying to put more and more weight on council tax is only going to work up to a point. So then the issue is, are there other ways of finding at the margin more money for local government that take the pressure off the council tax?
I think, yes, adding to all that, I think when you look at what councils have done to create income streams, it's all about, I think, being clear about what is it that the outcome that you're going for. So is it income you're going for from in a commercial sense, or is it about regeneration? I think where things does, or is it about, new house building, like for instance, brick by brick in London Borough of Croydon. I think where things go badly wrong are the governance failures, but also where no one's entirely sure what they're aiming at. And then if you add to that poor governance and a lack of information and transparency, you do have a recipe for problems. So being clear at the very start about what this entrepreneurial thing that you're going to do is about, and also proper sensitivity analysis. So what if it takes twice as long to set up? What if it costs twice as much? And what if it brings in half as much as you think? Is it still a good wheeze? I think we'd be wise on that.
We've got quite enthusiastic about devolving powers to local governments, and clearly it's something that's going to continue. But we're still not really in the business, are we, of devolving the ability to raise money? No. Is that something across government? Is it the Treasury behind the scenes? Or politically has no one got the radical initiative and the confidence to go and do it?
I mean, if I may, some of the answer lies in your question, I think, if I may say so. I mean, of course, the Treasury has long been cautious, under all governments of all parties, of letting go of taxation in general. I mean, they see it as theirs to control, and unusually, by international standards, local government spending, as funded out of taxation, falls within total managed expenditure. So in the end, what local government does, all of it, apart from that funded from fees and charges, counts within the total national public expenditure. The issue of new taxes or giving local government a broader tax base has eluded all. We were talking outside before we came in here. It's 50 years since the Layfield Committee next year, and that committee's report laid out very clearly the choice to be made between having a more locally free and autonomous system of local government raising more of its money locally, possibly with a local income tax, or having local government as an agent of central government receiving whatever income the government would give it at the time. And we've tended to go down the second route, I suspect. And so the opportunities for radicalism are, I think, heavily constrained by the Treasury's unwillingness to let go.
Andy?
I mean, I think we have an ESRC project at the moment trying to identify incremental, moderate and more radical changes in this regard in terms of trying to fix some of these funding issues. And there are clearly much discussed incremental things like revaluing council tax going beyond 1991 property values, tweaking other bits of these smaller, wider local taxes, tourism taxes, things like that, all the way through to, assigning shares of national revenues like stamp duty, income tax and all the rest of it. So that's at the radical end of things. Even shifting the basis away in terms of local taxes from property to land value tax, these sorts of things. A lot of this stuff is already out there as ideas. This committee has been looking at them, I think, for some time under your previous chairing, Clive. So I think the issue becomes then the kind, as you're hinting at, the political will, the momentum, then to actually try and reconfigure the system then to actually implement some of these things and introduce them, which, as we were saying earlier, with the nature of a very complex, difficult Byzantine system, it's politically difficult, costly, and is never going to be at the government's top of the priority list, I suspect.
Just one brief thought which comes up under this discussion is that the relationship between council tax changes and spending changes is erratic at best. So the idea of accountability driven by council taxpayers or indeed business rate payers, given that actually their tax payments are really to central government then redistributed, but I think it's very easy for businesses to think they're paying money to the council to be spent locally, and we pay money to the council through council tax to be spent locally, but the relationship between those payments and what people receive, either council, residents or businesses, is very, very, very weak. Spending can go up, council tax can go down, council tax down, spending up, hardly any relationship.
And of course the pressures in both adults and children's services means that most councils are spending a greater and greater, so for most councils that's what, two-thirds, three-quarters of their expenditure, more and more of their money going on a smaller and smaller part of the
What you're saying then is that tinkering with the system, which we're doing, is ultimately going to fail. So we've got to do something fairly radical.
Well, I don't know if
I'm putting words in your mouth, probably.
I don't know if it'll fail so much as you can. What we've seen over the past few years is tinkering and tweaking and accreting bits and changing things, and we've more or less kept the show on the road. The question is whether you want to carry on doing that or whether you want to do something more radical, in which case it would need political decisions at the highest levels to be able to do that. Because it'd have to be taxes that brought in quite a lot of money. A tourist tax is not going to cut it when you look at the amount of money that comes in from council tax and business rates.
Although worth noting that most of the things that we put on the radical list are only radical here, in large part while their business as usual.
A few members indicating that obviously the revenue raising Joe, Chris, and then I'll get Clive.
Just a quick follow-up for Tony. So the accountability point I think is very interesting. If you were to fully devolve business rates and council tax, you obviously would create, it comes back to the inequality point we were talking about earlier, but do you think that presumably could be a way of improving accountability?
Yes, I think having some sort of relationship between how the council spending changes and what people pay in tax, not only at the local level, it seems to me across the whole of government, is an essential prerequisite of democracy and people understanding how their taxes affect spending and spending is affected by taxes. So I think recreating a relationship between spending changes at the local level and so the relationship between spending and taxing is essential. Now, if you were to relocalise the business rate, it causes significant problems, particularly in London, of course, because it's very unequally distributed. The tax base, Westminster, where we are, has a tax base bigger than dozens of other authorities added together. So you'd have to have some form of redistribution, but relocalising business rate would, I suspect, help in increasing local autonomy.
Okay. Chris?
I suppose if we accept Clive's point that it would be good to have some more of this and the tinkering isn't going to work, And I think if we also accept the premise that pigs will fly before the Treasury accepts the radical option, what's the kind of middle ground? So, okay, tourist tax, not radical. Maybe devolving powers to combined authorities to redo their council tax bans might be second on the list. The point about business rates being third. What's the kind of next 3 or 4 things that you can think of that might be something that you could convince the Treasury of?
One thing each for short on time.
One thing each. I think that a lot of council finance directors, council taxes in bands A to H. Well, one of them said to me, I don't mind council tax. He said, but I want to use the whole alphabet. So I think looking at tweaking the bandings, and painful as it might be, a revaluation. Yeah.
Andy, Jonathan?
Well, I think some of the other things that they can do locally, like community infrastructure levies, Section 106 type things for kind of developer contributions, some scope and innovation for things like tax increment financing. Again, these are all not, they're all out there and in use in various places. The issue is, as we've touched upon, I think, is they work in particular places better than others, you see. So where they do work, great. Give the local authority scope to run with them, but you're going to have to then worry about the places where they're not going to work, and those are typically those with areas with greater need, weaker tax bases, and the ones that need most kind of redistribution. So it's getting those equalisation, redistribution mechanisms in line with the other innovations, I think, which is the real challenge.
I think in the end you need assigned portions of national taxes, income tax, stamp duty. Whether that fits your criteria of something that the Treasury can be convinced of, I'm not sure.
I
think my colleagues have said all the best things, but I think the Treasury probably needs to lighten up a bit, because in the sense that local government left to its own devices wouldn't only put council tax up, some of them would cut it competitively. And the evidence of the past is that some councils put it up, some put it down, and as I say, more debate in local elections about council tax levels. And, I always thought if council set income tax, there'd be a very high turnout in local elections. So, so I think that allowing a bit more differentiation and therefore more argument at the local level about tax levels and spending levels would be something the Treasury could do with effect.
Right. Thank you very much. I think there's some really good, useful points that we will be milling over as we continue to discuss this. And thank you very much for your opinion before the committee this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just going to do changeover of guests. We are still recording. Yeah. Can we just get our guests to introduce themselves for the committee? Start with you, David.
Yes, so my name is David Phillips. I'm an Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I lead our work on devolved and local government finance.
Fantastic. Charlotte.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Pickles. I'm Director at Reform Think Tank.
Let you get your breath first.
Hi, I'm Stuart Hoddinott. I'm a Senior Researcher at the Institute for Government. I lead our work on local government finance, among other things.
Fantastic. Thank you for coming before the committee this morning. This is our first evidence session looking at the funding and sustainability of local government finance. We've just had our first panel just giving us some thoughts, just outlining what we think of the cost pressures, where we think those key issues are. Lively discussion in terms of raising revenue. We've got a range of questions from members on this second panel, and we'll kick off with Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So I'm going to talk about national insurance increase on local government. So council tax can be raised by 2.99% or a fiver if you're in the lowest quartile. And usually over the last couple of years, inflation has been above what that brings into local councils. So what do you think the impact of the new employers' national insurance increase will be on local councils?
David.
If I might come in there first, please. So I think I'd make a couple of points here. So the first one is I think it's clear that the government has only decided to compensate for the direct costs of national insurance. So that is not just within councils but across the public sector. So there's compensation on effectively aimed at covering the estimated costs of directly employed workers. Now there's some debate about whether it's covering even that. But what it does mean is that there is not any additional funding to cover outsourced workers. So, for example, say if it's in social care, or I guess on average at the district level, some authorities would have outsourced, say, elements of their refuse collection and so on and so forth. Now, the way the government allocated the funding to individual councils, though, it didn't look at what they're spending on directly employed labour. It looked actually at their overall service spending. So the allocation method is based not on what you're paying on your own labour, it's based on what your service spending is. The idea being there that they don't want to penalise councils that outsourced more, maybe to have cost savings or maybe to do things differently. So whilst the total amount going to local government is designed to compensate for directly employed staff, the allocation to individual councils is designed not to penalise those individual councils that outsourced more or outsourced less of their workforce. So that's kind of the first point I'd make on the allocation method there. The second point I'd say is that I think this year, when it comes to the amount of funding going to local government, it's important not just to look at council tax or even just what's in core spending power. Councils have quite a new major source of revenue called EPR, Extended Producer Responsibilities, which is the levy on producers of packaging. So the retailers have recently been complaining about that. You might have seen the Marks and Spencer's directive, I think it was, complaining about this yesterday. But that, for councils in England, will raise about £1.1 billion, generally to basically help pay for the existing work they're doing on refuse collection and so on and so forth. Now, the reason I mentioned that is that for district councils, if you look at what's in core spending power and include the compensation for national insurance, they're only getting about 1.2% cash increase in their funding. That's way below inflation. That'll mean, difficult choices. But if you add in the EPR funding, the extra income from this, it goes to about an 8% increase in their total funding. So it really does change the picture substantially for Shire District Councils, that picture. The last thing I'd say is that I think in the short term, I would expect the main impact of the higher national insurance to be on the employers. But the OBR has said that in the long run, drawing on evidence, what it would expect is that wage settlements over the next few years, both in the private sector and public sector, will be lower than they otherwise would have been, and that a lot of this cost will be shifted on to employees. Now, that doesn't mean it's costless, of course. That means workers are bearing the cost of the national insurance increase rather than councils. But I would expect the impact on councils' finances of the national insurance increase to be greater in this kind of first year or two, and over time, it'll be the workers that will be bearing more of that cost.
Yeah, I agree with everything David said. I think I would add that, David alluded to it, that the compensations for direct NICs costs to local authorities. There will be indirect costs that hit local authorities because the NICs rise predominantly through higher fees from providers. For adult social care, for example, Nuffield Trust estimates that there's about 665 million indirect cost to local authorities of the NICs rise for which local authorities are not compensated. So that will come in the form of higher fees. It will mean either reducing the amount of care that local authorities provide, or it will mean paying more for the same amount of care that they already provide. That will obviously be replicated across all local authority services, but adult social care is one particularly large budget area for local authorities.
I mean, just really very briefly, as it's being covered very well, clearly this could be seen as one of the examples of unfunded mandates, albeit a slightly indirect one, where actually you are applying a significant additional cost burden to local authorities. And as is already pointed out, this is particularly in the case of where there is providers rather than direct employees, which is the vast majority of social care, which is one of the biggest pressures currently affecting local government finances. And of course, we haven't mentioned the increase in the national living wage, which as a policy is obviously a good thing, funding, but that's exactly the sort of people that this is also hitting. So it's not just the NICS increase, but it's a collection of things. The only thing I think I'll probably say, I'm sure we'll come on to this and was picked up in your previous panel, but of course some of the other things that we've heard mentioned also may have impacts on growth. And so in terms of thinking about the whole of the finance system for councils in the round, you can't look at any of these one pots without thinking what are the implications for whether businesses want to invest there, whether they want to expand, grow, which has huge implications then for other revenues that councils are seeking to bring in.
So do you think then the councils that have done well to keep their council tax low, to keep money in people's pockets, are being unfairly punished in terms of they're still having to deal with all of these cost increases, but their council tax base is low because they've chosen either to freeze or keep money in people's residents' pockets?
There's always choices, right? So if you are, and these are choices obviously politically in local areas, so if the choice is to keep council tax low, but that means you can't then fund your costs or you're having to cut services as a result of it, that's a choice, and that's what the whole process of democratic elections are supposed to expose. I do think there is a fundamental fairness question where we have councils that have become bankrupt and have now been given permission to go well above the increases. That is the general rule. So I think Birmingham is being able to increase their council tax by 5.5% while simultaneously massively slashing services. And Tony mentioned this in the previous panel. I think that has serious democratic implications, and I do think serious fairness implications. But ultimately, the only way you're going to create a stable, sustainable local government finance system is by being more radical, which I hope we come on to, because actually council tax, as again has already been covered, doesn't really give you enough flex to be able to make the sorts of decisions about the makeup of how you are raising funds and spending money.
I think also it's worth saying that, yes, local authorities have historically taken, there's been more variation in the amount they raise council tax by, but in the last few years there has been, almost all local authorities have taken almost the entire referendum limit and precepts where they can do. So I think almost all local authorities are now feeling the pressure to the extent that they, even the ones that want to protect residents from having council tax increases, are being forced to put through the maximum amount they can do in their council tax increase every year.
And on that, I would also say that historically, a lot of the variation reflects decisions made at the local level. It's right that local areas bear the costs or gain the gains of what they do at a local level. But the referendum limits, because they effectively constrain councils' ability to adjust their council tax over time if circumstances change, they can make it difficult for councils to respond to cost pressures that arise, or, as we might see in the next few years, quite a big redistribution of funding when you update the funding system. So I think there's a strong case, particularly for those councils that set a historically low council tax that could lose out under a reform funding system, and you might argue are already finding it more difficult to deal with these rising costs, to give them more flexibility to respond to that via removing or substantially amending how the council tax referendum limits work. And of course, that won't be popular at a local level. People have got used to paying low council tax. But ultimately, under a system of part local financing, you sort of, if you want to set a low council tax, you need to have lower spending. If you want to have the higher spending, you need to have higher council tax. So I would remove those limits rather than, if you like, compensate centrally for those councils that have chosen in the past to set low council tax.
Okay, thank you. Maya.
So my constituency is Ribble Valley in Lancashire, very rural area, can take me about an hour to drive from one side to the other, and obviously there are very logistical issues that raises for local services. What do you make of the current this year's settlement, in light particularly of the discontinuing of the Rural Services Delivery Grant, and do you feel it's fair?
I think I agree with you that it is often much more expensive to deliver services in rural areas. I think on the Rural Service Delivery Grant specifically, I think if you look at the relative changes that those local authorities that have benefited from the Rural Service Delivery Grant for the last few years have had in their spending power since 2010, yes, they've taken a hit since last year, but they have done much better than other local authorities in more deprived urban parts of the country overall since 2010. Their average change in core spending power is about 0.2% increase in between 2010 and 2025-26, compared to about a minus 7.5% average for the rest of the country. So yeah, I think that obviously they will be disappointed this year, and they might struggle to deliver some of those services. But I think overall they've done better than other local authorities over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to kind of like comment on the fairness of the issue. What I would say is that what we saw during the 2010s was much bigger cuts for more deprived, typically more urban areas. The pattern actually started to change under the last Conservative administration under Boris Johnson and his successors, where from about 2020 onwards, the increases, because they largely came through grants and business rates, council tax actually barely kept pace with inflation during those years. Because a lot of it comes through grants, that benefited the more deprived areas, and we've seen in its first finance settlement, Labour doubled down on that. But as Stuart was saying, it partially, but doesn't fully undo that pattern we saw back in the 2010s. And I think this kind of comes to kind of the sort of real question we're kind of grappling with at the moment with local government finance reform. Fairness, to some extent, is in the eye of the beholder. Yeah. You cannot have a fully objective assessment of what councils need and how much they can raise themselves. You need to make subjective judgments on what you think is an appropriate amount of services for different types of people and what's an appropriate amount of tax for different types of people to pay. So whilst MHCLG can do a technical sort of consultation and development of a process, ultimately politicians need to decide what is fair.
And just building on that sort of what's appropriate, just again touching on rural areas, many rural councils face significantly higher costs for home to school transport. So could you talk a little bit about how you think that pressure could be better alleviated?
So we have looked at home to school transport, and particularly in the context of the SEND budgets, which is obviously a huge pressure on local councils, not specifically in a rural context, but totally understand your point that obviously the distances are far greater in rural communities. And at a minimum, we have argued that there should be means testing of this rather than a presumption that councils should just fund this service. I think you could also look at, and again, I can't speak specifically to the rural context, but I think we should also be looking at sharing transport as well. And a lot of this is going on just single kids going in taxis to school, rather than thinking more creatively about how we can make this system more affordable. But at a minimum, we think one of the ways to reduce costs, and this is something we've heard a lot from local government themselves, is to means test that rather than having that assumption that councils just pay for it because they cannot afford it. And actually that's not a fair model to have in place.
And just to, so I guess, stress test that a bit. So I think, I believe that in rural areas, the cost of homeschool transport is around £93 per pupil, which is about 10 times the average in urban city areas. So I guess following the logic, would you say that if in a means tested situation, there would be cases in rural areas where actually the funding would need to be much higher to support some of those services where the logistics require it?
Yeah, I mean, clearly you have to choose where you set your means test, right? And once you've set it, if you have longer journeys and you have a kind of much more spread out schooling, then clearly you would need to think about making sure there is additional funding going to areas where those costs will still remain high. I mean, coming back to your original point about the fairness of the current settlement, I mean, I think we sort of all alluded it to, but we could just put it bluntly that there isn't enough money in the system, right? So all of this is trade-offs, all of this is choices, ultimately. And, you know, we at Reform are broadly supportive of the refocus towards deprivation because of the shift over the last few years. We think that is important. But ultimately, unless we're willing to be more radical and think about both the total money going in, the ability for local areas to raise revenues themselves, and start thinking a bit more about how you do that restructure in a more radical way, then actually we're just going to keep having conversations about, shall we pit this area against this area, and that's never going to be fair.
I'm going to move on to multi-year settlements.
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to encourage you to continue on that let's think radical side of things. Obviously, we're starting to move to a multi-year settlement. Most people agree that provides more certainty, and even if money is tight, that still helps. I think we can always take that as given, but what do you think are the drawbacks of this? Obviously, I know Unison has highlighted some concerns of actually multi-year settlement without an increase is still a real problem. Does having a multi-year settlement lock in some of the problems we've got with inadequate funding, particularly with council tax base being based on early 90s house values? And I'll briefly mention unitarisation. How do you think multi-year settlement works when councils are fundamentally, or half of them are going to fundamentally change over that time? Do you think those that are going through a reorganisation have to be taken out of that multi-year settlement, or does that have to be reviewed throughout that time?
Hi, yes. So the way I see multi-year settlements is they can't provide certainty, but they can provide clarity to a local government. So the reason I say they can't provide certainty is that we don't know actually what's going to happen over the next 3 years. We don't know what's going to happen to inflation. So if you set a cash amount for local government at the outset and say this is what you're going to get over the next 3 years, well, actually, in real terms, after accounting for inflation and the cost pressures, that is probably less certain for councils, if you like, than if you have some flexibility to respond to inflation. So I think the way to kind of think about multi-year settlements is that we're going to guarantee you a base amount, and then we'll provide some clarity on how we'll adjust that if circumstances change, if inflation's higher than expected, if demands are higher than expected, and so on. So I see it as a way to provide clarity rather than certainty. I think another aspect of this, and there's a lot of debate about this, councils tend not to be very keen on this, but I think actually it can be quite important. Over that multi-year period, I think you need to make some assumptions about what's going to happen to the populations of different areas using population projections, and what different areas can raise through council tax over those years. Because if, for example, say let's hold population fixed, let's hold council tax fixed, well, those areas that have more faster population growth will tend to lose out. Those areas that can raise less through council tax increases will lose out. I think councils kind of worry that, oh, this means you're putting a target on our population growth or a target on our council tax increases. That's not the case. Central government will always, when it's deciding how to allocate money between the NHS and councils, say, well, councils can raise some through council tax. When you build in some assumption about what's going to happen to council tax when you allocate between councils, you're just making sure you're reflecting the fact that Surrey can raise a lot more from council tax increases going forward than Sunderland can, for example. And you mentioned about unitarisation. My view here would be that I think they could still be in the sort of core multi-year settlement. That will be required actually probably for kind of spending control totals at the MHCLG level. But I think you also need to kind of assess what is, if you like, the trajectory of the expected cost savings from unitarisation. The government has said it expects there to be cost savings in the longer run. Now, the evidence is you get less in terms of economies of scale cost savings. You get more in terms of economies of scope. The fact you can link up services together, which might improve services, but doesn't necessarily save you much money. But, you know, if the government expects savings of £500 million a year, say, over the long run, maybe that doesn't come in the short term. Maybe in the short term there's a cost, and then you start to save money. So I think they perhaps might need to be sort of a transition fund, if you like, where in the short term these areas get some funding to support the move to unitarisation, and in the longer term, perhaps in the next spending review, when you think their now fixed costs are lower, some of that money can be redistributed to those areas that haven't had that change in governance.
Charlotte?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are several drawbacks to it. I want to say up front, we're very pro. So we do think that it will give greater clarity. Clearly, it's hugely beneficial for just general planning. And, you know, we've already touched on the lack of preventative interventions. You can't really do that if you're going year to year. So there are definitely benefits. I think one of the biggest risks, and clearly you can solve the inflation question with some type of uprating mechanism if government wanted to do that. We do that in lots of other areas, including in benefits. I think the new burdens mandate issues are actually the biggest challenge if you've already done that, and how that works in a sort of multi-year settlement, and then actually government decides they want to change policy in an area or they want to do something differently, and how far is central government actually going to behave in a way that matches having multi-year settlements, I think is an issue. I think there's also a question about whether you are going to allow greater revenue raising flexibility in that. So clearly the settlement is about the money you're giving. You know, actually, I think it would be in the interest of the Treasury, despite obviously the kind of hesitance, to have more flexibility around revenue raising. But actually, if you said, well, this is your budget, but we're also going to give you more flexibility to raise revenue at a local level, then you would have an ability to respond if something changes within that multi-year settlement. So actually, the revenue raising becomes really important as the flip side of that coin. And the other thing I would say just very briefly is I think this is actually where the scale comes in really as a really important factor here. So actually, if you were to devolve and sit more of these budgets at a regional scale, you would be able to do equalisation and have greater flexibility across a region where you would have probably quite different types of areas that might need responding. But if you're sitting at a regional level, you have more flexibility to be able to actually respond to patches of difference, demographic shifts, deprivation, whatever it might be in an area. The problem is we sit very, very little, despite the current government's ambitions, at a regional level, so you don't have that scale to be able to respond.
Yeah, completely agree as well with everything everyone said. Really welcome them moving to multi-year settlements. I think there's another thing I'd like to add to that is multi-year settlements are beneficial as long as there's no cliff edge. The cliff edge is the point at which the problems emerge. People find, or local authorities find it very difficult to commission services when your funding will run out in 2 months' time. So it isn't enough just to say we're going to have a multi-year settlement and then in another 3 years we will have another multi-year settlement. There needs to be some sort of rolling basis for that settlement as well to provide more clarity. The inflation point I think is a really good one. The GP's contract from 2019 is a perfect example of a service that committed to cash terms funding, which is then completely destroyed over the following 5 years. I think in terms of this long-term settlement, I come back to the point of quantum of funding. The funding for 25-26 is higher than expected because of an expanded overall spending envelope from the budget. Local government funding is unprotected beyond 25-26, and that implies real terms cuts to grant funding of about 1.3% per year. After council tax increases, that will be about a 1.2% core spending power increase for every year between now and 29-30. So that total core spending power for local authorities is not going to increase arguably enough to meet some of the pressures that we've been discussing today. And it will leave spending power still about 2.5% lower in real terms in 2030 than in 2010. So it's not just about the sort of the certainty in the multi-year settlement, it's also about how much money over that time local authorities can expect.
Good on that, thank you. Just moving on to council tax. Which political party will take that by the horns, Chris?
Yes, I quite liked Will's introduction of be radical, so we'll go with that. First question, will the decision by the government to allow certain local authorities to raise their thresholds for increasing council tax before triggering a referendum help these councils close existing funding shortfalls? I'll ask Charlotte first.
I imagine on the modelling side, you probably want to ask the IFS on it, but I can give you a kind of general view. No, it's not going to be sufficient because the holes in local government finances are too big. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there are particular councils where the funding is in such crisis that they have been given exceptions to those numbers and so are allowed to raise significantly higher. But ultimately, and again, you've already heard this, but we need to do a full revaluation of council tax because unless you can actually get, not least because it's phenomenally regressive at the moment. So if you actually wanted to make sure that people who are wealthier are paying more, you'd need to address the fact that the current council tax system doesn't work.
Right, we'll go to David to the modelling, then we'll come back to revaluation.
Well, actually, we do the work on revaluation as well at the IFS, so maybe we can come on to that as well. So, in terms of modelling, I haven't sort of been able to model, how much this would. Well, we've modelled how much it would raise for these councils. So, £45 million from these exceptional rises across the councils in question. What we would say is that it's notable that in 5 of these areas, Birmingham, Trafford, Newham, Windsor, Maidenhead and Bradford, they had tax rates that started in the lowest quarter nationally. Somerset, on the other hand, exceeded the national average. Now, the reason I mentioned that is, I mentioned in earlier answer to the question, one of the effects of the referendum requirement is if you historically set low council tax rates, it makes it harder for you to respond to financial pressures. So the fact that 5 of the 6 councils here that have had to go and ask for additional flexibility are those that have the bottom quarter of council tax rates, I think is indicative that these referendum minutes are biting particularly for those councils that historically set low council tax. So I think that adds to the calls to increase flexibility over council tax, particularly for those that have set historically low council tax rates. Should we come on to revaluation later?
No, go on, do revaluation.
So we looked at revaluation and the impacts in England back in 2020 for sort of a major report. Clearly, evaluation is an important aspect of making council tax fit for purpose. As it stands at the moment, properties are valued on the basis of 1991 values. The issue there is not that values have gone up so much across the country since then. What you could and should do is just reset the thresholds to reflect that national rise in values. The issue is that different properties have seen such different increases in property values, up sort of 6 or 7-fold in London, up 3 or 4-fold in the northeast of England, for example. So probably half of properties are in effectively the wrong band than if they were valued now, and nationally the same share are in each band as under the current system. And you can have properties that are now worth the same, but face tax bills many hundreds of pounds different per year because they used to be worth different amounts 34 years ago when Gorbachev was president of the Soviet Union. So it really is a relic of the 20th century.
It's older than some of the committee members.
It might be older it's not older than me, unfortunately, but maybe some of the committee members. But yeah, so revaluation, I think, is a kind of a necessary step. You could also go further and you could reform council tax to reduce the regressivity of it. It's currently a much higher share of values for low-value properties and so on. You could also kind of pair it with wider reforms to the tax system. We currently have very high taxes if you sell a high-value property, but very low taxes actually just to live in a high-value property. That isn't a very effective way of taxing property. Actually, it makes more sense to reduce stamp duty and to increase council tax. You'd ungum the housing market. You'd boost the economy and increase fairness. So I think council tax reform is an important thing. I don't think it really addresses, though, that much the fiscal sustainability of local government, at least in the short term, because I think to get this through, you would need politically to have a revenue-neutral reform so that it doesn't raise more, it doesn't raise less. What I think could happen then, though...
Easier to get it through if it was a...
Or a revenue-cutting reform, exactly. But what I think could happen, if you made it revalued and you say reduce the bills at the bottom and increase them at the top, going forwards, it might be easier to raise money at the margin. So I think in the short term, it wouldn't really raise you money, and you say you might lose your money. In the longer term, then it might make it a more fit-for-purpose tax you can raise more from.
Just on this, Stuart, I mean, obviously, I think broadly everyone almost certainly accepts that property prices when Gorbachev was in charge is not a sensible way in order to do this, so we should change it. Do you have any views on how practically we might go about that without running into issues? And specifically, do you think that maybe doing it at a national level is quite difficult? Is it something where you could give the power to combined authorities in order to do the re-evaluation, and if not, why not?
Yeah, that's an interesting set of questions. I don't really have a good view on how best to do it. I mean, I think that combined authorities maybe help with some of that trade-off. They can sort of make decisions between different parts of their regions, choose local authorities that maybe help to smooth some of that political pressure. On this topic a bit more widely, I think that it is interesting that the government has given this power to 6 local authorities for this year. I think it's a real change in approach to the previous government, who relied much more on capitalisation directions to support struggling local authorities. In fact, Somerset requested a council tax rise in 2023-24 and was rejected and given a capitalisation direction. I think we would argue this is a much more effective approach to addressing financial distress in local authorities than capitalisation directions, which are generally sort of one-off pots of money that are not well suited to addressing ongoing needs. So I think the sort of more general approach of more flexibility for council tax is welcome.
Sorry, good. You shook your head on...
I shook my head on... So I don't think that having revaluation done at a local area or combined authority area would be consistent with having a national equalisation system. Because if you say let local areas, let combined authorities revalue properties, and say properties in one area be valued on 2023 values, another area 2027 values, another 2029 values, how do you then do a comparison of what can they effectively raise through council tax when you then work out how much grant funding to give them, which is a core element of how our system currently works? Because you need a common basis to assess effectively, what is their revenue raising capacity, and if different authorities have got values based on different years, that is quite a difficult thing to do. So I think what you might want to do is have revaluation done at a national level, but then allow combined authorities or local areas below combined authorities to then have more control over the structure of the tax, so that for a given valuation, different areas can decide whether they think higher value properties should have more tax in an area or lower value properties, and actually perhaps how they distribute funding between different authorities. Say perhaps in London, it might be decided that... Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, there's a way through this, right, I think, which is you do the revaluation so that we know the numbers that local authorities could potentially raise, that solves the grant funding problem, and then you allow combined authorities in order to make the decision on whether they adopt those or keep the old system.
You could do that. Yes, you could do that, but you would then need to make sure that you keep updating this revaluation every now and nationally, and then I guess one challenge could be that I guess VOA and councils would be operating under two or multiple systems where you've got national values and bandings based on national systems, and then you're also operating a shadow system, if you like, at the local authority level. So it adds complexity, but we potentially could do that.
Will, and then Lewis quickly.
Thank you. I think we've all found this very useful, that you've outlined this is how you could do it, but you've highlighted that actually there's almost no way you increase the overall budget to local councils by a revaluation. Even, and I just want to pose a few questions for you, even with the transition arrangement, because actually if London council tax should be a lot higher, you might be able to get to that over a 5-10 year period, not in one. So what's your comment on transition? Also, in terms of if this was actually going to be delivered, surely you would want some pilot projects for one council area to do a revaluation for the government to iron out the kinks to then roll it out nationally, or you think that's not desirable either?
Yes, so on the first point, I think you can do it on a revenue-raising basis. So in Scotland, it didn't revalue properties, but it did make some changes back in 2017 where they increased the effective tax rates on bands E to H. They did that with the aim of raising revenues. Because effectively councils kept the same band D rate and they just were raising a bit more from those band E to H properties. So you can do that. I think the kind of question is political sort of will. In Scotland, the narrative is very much we're raising more from higher earners and higher value properties to raise more public services. That was the narrative. In Wales, as they've been going about it, and as they went about it in 2005, it was, we're just updating this to reflect the current situation. No one's going to win, or some will win, some will lose, but on average, it's revenue neutral. So I think to some extent it depends on the political narrative you're selling. If you want to sell it as revenue raising, you need a narrative that is about making higher value properties pay more for helping improve public services. So there's a choice there. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think you perhaps would see a greater ability to raise revenues at the margin going forward, so over that 5-10 year period, because if, for example, you didn't just revalue, you also made it less aggressive, so high value properties paid more, low value property pays less, you'd be less concerned about the impact of council tax increases on low income pensioner households and so on, because more of the burden would be on the higher income households. So councils might feel more comfortable in raising council tax if they didn't feel it was being quite so heavily paid by the lower and middle income households. And then the last part on terms of piloting, I'd say that I think that we can kind of see what Wales is doing as a pilot. Wales has done a lot of work already on sort of, the mechanics of evaluation. The VOA has produced updated values for Wales for April 2023. There's a lot that can be learned on the mechanics of how you do that. Wales also did it in 2005. One of the issues in doing it for a single pilot authority is that nowadays how this would probably work is rather than sending people around in vans to look at properties, they would use statistical modelling techniques. They work much better when you have lots and lots of data in it.
Right, thank you. Just looking at our last few areas, business rates, Joe.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, so just a quick discussion on business rates. How do you assess the current system and the problems within it and the changes that the Chancellor has announced? Who wants to go first? Charlotte?
Sure. So we're obviously pleased that they're looking at business rates. We don't think it's going to make a fundamental difference in terms of what's in the consultation at the moment. And the thing that I think we find most concerning about business rates is the disincentive to invest in property, so the growth impact of the current model, which is why we have proposed replacing business rates with a land value tax. Now, you would have similar questions about doing the valuation, but actually if you could do it with business rates, that also may let you later on also apply it to replace council tax. But for the business rates point, if you had a land value tax, it would have various different benefits. It would stop penalising the small businesses that tend to find business rates to be more difficult to pay than obviously the larger businesses. It would incentivise actually improving properties and investing in your business, which obviously business rates currently penalises because then your rates will go up. It obviously also helps with things like tackling land speculation, land banking, all that kind of stuff. You could zone it if you're in a local area to make decisions about how you want your land to be used, so that you weren't penalising, in rural communities. You weren't saying actually the land value was so high because we expect commercial. Actually, you could do agricultural. So our view is actually that the business rates model is not fit for purpose, not least because it's doing the absolute opposite of what you want, which is to incentivise business and growth in a local area, and a land value tax would help to tackle that.
Stuart?
I don't have anything to add to that.
So I would echo the calls for a land value tax. I think many of the complexities we have with the business rate system as it stands is because we're recognising the fact they're kind of harming growth and incentives to invest in property, and we're complexifying that tax rather than tackling the fundamental issues that we should not be taxing buildings. We should be taxing the land that the buildings sit on. What I'd say about the kind of current government's proposals, clearly they're aimed, if you like, at supporting kind of high street operators, whether that's retailers or hospitality and leisure and so on. Now, because the supply of property in this country is pretty inflexible when it comes to kind of prices, we have a problem in terms of like building and building responding to kind of price signals in the market. Now, what that means is that the actual economic instance who ultimately bears the burden of things like business rates tends to be, in the long run, less so the occupier and more so the landlord that is the landowner. Now, what that means is that in the longer term, what I'd expect the biggest beneficiaries of lower business rates in town centres, higher business rates than out of town, is not to be it helps the town centre retailers, but it helps the town centre landlords. So, again, I think this is another issue where thinking about the tax more fundamentally rather than just trying to tweak the current system might address these issues in a better way. And again, come back to what we mentioned about council tax. There's a real opportunity here for the government, if it was ambitious, to say, let's fundamentally reform property tax. We've got a stamp duty that is gumming up the housing market and stopping people moving. We've got business rates that is stopping firms from expanding their properties. We've got council tax, which is out of date and penalises low value and low income households. Let's reform a lot of this and let's end up with a much better system as a whole. It was therefore disappointing in the budget that we didn't see the start of a real tax strategy. We saw a sort of bit of a piecemeal approach to tax reform.
That's good. And I think on that note, we've, both panels today have just looked at some of the pressures. One pressure which we didn't hone in on enough is temporary accommodation. We have a situation where across the 32 boroughs in London, they are spending £4 million a day just on temporary accommodation. You've seen a situation where some London boroughs are having to come forward to ask for exceptional funding support, which, if you really drill down on it, it's a form of borrowing. Again, more pressures that the councils are looking at. Just looking at the consultation on further reform, I mentioned that it closes tomorrow. If anyone hasn't submitted, I'm sure you all have. Do you feel that actually what the government are proposing, they need to go further and faster? And as we've heard, actually, is it really radical? Just looking at some of the things that you've been looking at reform, Charlotte.
Yeah, absolutely. The temporary accommodation is a huge burden, and we heard earlier that can be for different reasons in different areas. Actually, so we've said two things. Obviously, one of the things that the government is doing, which we're hugely behind is house building, and particularly social housing, because obviously that's a massive issue. If you look at the difference in cost for private rental market versus social housing or housing association, massive difference in terms of costs. But one of the things they should be doing immediately is addressing the temporary accommodation subsidy, which is still tied to 2011 LHA rates, and it pays 90% of that. That is the absolute definition of an unfunded mandate, that you are requiring local areas to only be able to provide this thing and only be able to claw back a portion of what that actual cost is. So there'd be something you could do immediately, which is, I say immediately, obviously the Treasury would need to agree to it, but that would be something you could do very quickly, which would immediately increase the cash flow to local areas to genuinely enable them to fund this accommodation.
In terms of the consultation on the reform of local government finance, what would you like to see, or what areas
overall?
Do you think the government may have missed
out?
So
look, we are for simplicity, we're for fairness. I can go on with these sort of generic words that we're for. The problem is it's not radical, right? It's all tweaking around the edges. And if we keep doing that, I think as Aileen said before, yes, we might be able to, keep toddling over the line, but we're not going to create a sustainable system. And you can apply that across the board to most public services, right? So actually we would say, great that you want to slightly improve some of these areas, but actually unless you're willing to do a fundamental rethink, and that does have to include revenue raising. We haven't touched on income tax and things like that, but actually the ambition in the white paper for devolution in terms of structural stuff is beyond what I think we might have expected, and that is great to see. We at Reform don't think it goes far enough. We think there's still more that we need to give greater powers and actual decision-making powers and budgets to that regional level, and we need to think about that regional level a bit more. But the financial reforms are not matching in any way that ambition in the structural side.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think radicalism would be great. I think one place that we would say that there should be more radical thinking is not looking at local authority budgets and spending in a silo, in a vacuum. Local authority services, demand for their services, their spending is directly influenced by services outside local authorities, by the NHS, by the criminal justice system, by welfare spending. I think it makes much more sense to be looking at how money is spent in a place rather than how it is spent by local authorities, by the NHS separately, because there is massive duplication between these services, and a failure to invest in one place can lead to more demand arising in another, particularly in local authority budgets. I would recommend much more investigation, willingness to think flexibly across budgets, across services, work out how best to invest to try and reduce demand across all services without just shoving acute demand from one part of the system to another.
David, really quickly.
Yeah, so I think that overall I'd welcome the government's consultation. It is tackling issues that need to be tackled, like the distribution of funding across councils. But it's really about the relative funding. How much do I provide how do I slice the pie up? But really what you also need to be considering, particularly for sustainability, is the size of the pie. Now, even if you're just trying to work out how big a slice should each one get, knowing how big the pie overall is, I think, is important. Because if, for example, the pie is small, you need to focus on just the most needy cases, maybe relatively more, but it needs to go to more deprived areas, for example. If your pie is bigger and you can cope with sort of a wider range of services, address the sort of perhaps less needy cases, perhaps it doesn't need to be quite so targeted at the most deprived parts of the population. So I think even within what the government's trying to do, some sense of what is the overall size of the pie, what are our expectations of what local government is expected to deliver, and how much that will cost to deliver, I think that part is missing from the government's thinking at the moment. I think partly because the Treasury tends to think, here's the money you've got, now divide it up, rather than here's what you're trying to achieve, this is how much it will cost, now you divide it up.
Yeah.
The last thing I would say is that I think that we don't take a position on how radical the reform should be in terms of devolution, but I think what needs to be important is that what you do on the funding system needs to align with what you're trying to achieve in terms of how services are delivered and how democracy basically is acted upon in this country. What you can't have is a system which is, say, very locally based, but you're trying to achieve very national standards. Or you can't have a system which is sort of very centrally funded, but you're trying to give local areas a lot of discretion to vary things. So I think seeing the service delivery and seeing the sort of accountability and democracy alongside what you're doing in the finance system That is also important. And perhaps linking a bit more between the devolution paper and the finance paper, I think, is something to look for as well. And if you're very much interested, there's a 9,000-word submission from us on our website.
Thank you. And I think that's a key question we will be able to present to the Minister. And, both. And it's good that both areas sit within Jim McMahon's portfolio. So thank you very much for coming to the Select Committee this morning.
Thank you.
Order.